a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. I think one of the most interesting things about baseball is that because of how long it's been around, I mean, we're talking about a sport that's been played since literally the 1800s in some capacity, that you can really pick out, any day in what you would consider the baseball playing calendar, and it would have incredibly interesting stuff that would have happened on that particular date. I mean, certainly as you get closer to October, it becomes even more pronounced because the World Series happens in October-ish every year. So there's been a lot of, October blanks where there's been a lot of World Series games.
And you make an interesting, point when you say it could happen at any day of the season, and you're right, because you say it's 150 plus years old. So I'm sure like there are July 4th. Everybody remembers July 4th in the United States. So there are double headers in the past. So there's some epic stuff that's happened on July 4th during the regular season.
There's probably some weird day in June 8th. Bet a lot of wacky stuff has happened on June 8th.
And I still get a one printed newspaper. It's a little local paper here, and they have a little column in there called This Date in Baseball. And for whatever reason, I love this column because all it does is bring back like things that I know about or I've heard about and I know more.
Now, this is not to be confused with their equally entertaining column of 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, where it's all like local stuff. So you read about stuff that happened 50 years ago in like high school baseball. We don't get this day in baseball treatment quite for this.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. So, randomly, we're going to talk about a day, I guess, in the calendar, but any day in October. I just saw the other day, October 14th, that day, Tommy Agee led off the game with a home run for the 1969 New York Mets and made two spectacular catches in the outfield on October 14th, 1969. And the most important thing was, I was there.
Yes,
I was there.
Why do I think I've heard this story before? Oh, yeah, because you've told me about that game like
that was an
billion
incredible.
He made two unbelievable catches.
Unbelievable. And they still show that stuff, by the way. We Met fans don't have that much to cheer about, so we're still looking at those
still
things.
Got to talk about
52 years later. We're
Agee
still excited about Tommy Agee's catches, I should say. So, but what piqued our interest was just another day. So you're going to talk about a day, and I think throw out some things that happen, and maybe the two of us can connect what we know outside of what might be written about that day or that season that it comes in.
Well, the day we're going to start off with, the day we kind of picked, and we were shocked by just how many different things happened on this day. And what's interesting also is you're going to see on this day, you're going to have games where World Series things happened and end of the season stuff happened in some, or end of playoff things happened. So it's not all just World Series stuff, but this is October 10th. So seeing as we were just talking about the Mets, I kind of figure we need to start off with a piece of Mets history, and that was their other World Series appearance in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was because in 1973, on October 10th, Tom Seaver led the Mets over the Cincinnati Reds in Game 5 of the ALCS and took them to the NLCS and took them to the World Series.
Right, where they proceeded to lose the World Series, but that series was punctuated. Okay, so here's what I remember. Pete Rose slides into Bud Harrelson, who's 160 pounds soaking wet, and Harrelson starts trying to fight him at second base when he tries to break up a double. No, Pete tries to break up double play, and the idea that little Bud Harrelson had the spunk to go after. Not that Pete Rose was a giant guy, but he was bigger than Bud Harrelson.
He wasn't 160 pounds dripping wet.
Exactly. So, and that series was only 5 games because the NLCS, when it first started, was only 5 games. It was
first to 3 instead of first to 4.
Right. Exactly. So I remember, that, and they lost the World Series, but Seaver probably had his best moment of the season in the playoffs because the World Series didn't quite go according to plan.
Quite. But I mean, it's just interesting looking through like how many different important things have happened on this day. Because like then you have, so that was the Mets making the World Series, except literally 5 years before that, Mickey Lolich won the World Series on October 10th for the Tigers, beating the St. Louis Cardinals in Game 7. And I believe we talked about that World Series in our greatest World Series episode because it was such an important such an interesting World Series.
Well, the Tigers have only won 4 World Series. So they won in 35, 45, this one in 1968, and they also won in 84. But Lolich wasn't the pitching star of the Tigers that year. It was a guy named Denny McLain, who won 31 games for the Tigers. He's the only guy, I should say the last guy, to win 30 games in the major leagues. And Mickey Lolich, this sort of portly left-hander, goes out and wins 3 games in the World Series and beats Bob Gibson, who was, of course, everybody's
Bob
favorite
Gibson,
pitcher.
yeah.
This is the year of the pitcher, 1968. Here we are. And Mickey Lolich ends up being the World Series MVP, and like, Mickey Lolich? And by the way, good career, definitely an almost guy.
Definitely, yeah. That's never a place you want to be, is definitely an almost guy. But I mean, it's just interesting looking at this. And I mean, I'm sure you probably have some things you remember from this date, given you've gone through a lot more October 10th than I have.
Yeah. So you mentioned that when you said 3 World Series games, it made me think of, and this is the same thing on this date, Lou Burdett. And we talked about Lou Burdett with the Braves in 1957, right?
Yep.
So they moved to Milwaukee. We read this whole book on, the heroes of Bushville and how Milwaukee was sort of a backwater town. So Burdett comes up with the Yankees in 1950, and I think Stengel doesn't like him, so he cuts him. So he's toiling away. He ends up in Milwaukee for a bunch of years. And sure enough, in 1957, the Braves get to the World Series. And who are they playing but the Yankees? And so who manages to win 3 games in the 1957 World Series?
I believe that there's only one person you can kind of name at this point. It's pretty
Lou
obvious.
Burdett has the series of his life. And by the way, the 2 teams played in the World Series the next year in 1958, but the Yankees won that series. Didn't go as well for Lou Burdett in that series.
But I mean, you even can go back even farther and pull up things, because this is what surprised me, that like you still have big name baseball players, big all-time names doing something on just a random date like October 10th. Now, obviously, if you look throughout the collection of any one player's history, they're going to be them doing something big on any given day. But it is just wild to think about. You look at October 10th. What was that? Oh, that was the Game 7 of the 1926 World Series, where Grover Alexander, the near 40-year-old.
Right. He was 39 years old. Grover Cleveland Alexander, they called him, but Pete Alexander was how he's known, and he had been around, as you say, for a long time. And he had and I remember reading about this as a kid. He had a big strikeout in that game, and I thought,
yes, in the bottom of the 7th inning, he strikes out Tony Lazzari with the bases loaded. In the 7th inning, he throws 2 2/3 scoreless innings, and then in the 9th inning, who comes up for the Yankees? But Babe Ruth.
Of course,
and now Babe Ruth had already hit a home run in this game. He had walked 2 other times, and so the Cardinals probably did what the logical thing would be and walked him. Now I don't know if that was an intentional walk or an unintentional intentional walk, but Babe Ruth ended up on first base, and then he proceeds to do something that would have him just destroyed in the current era. He tries to steal second base.
Well, he tries to steal second base, which means
not he was successful in stealing second base because he was thrown out at second base.
Let's set the scene. 2 outs
in the bottom of the 9th,
7th game of the World Series,
and he tries to steal second. Babe Ruth, big old fat Babe Ruth, thrown out at second base.
World Series over.
I
mean, I think if that happened today, unless his name was Derek Jeter and he wouldn't have made that stupid play.
Imagine if Mookie Betts gets thrown out stealing second in Game 7 against the Red Sox in the World Series this year.
Yeah, he's not a Dodger anymore.
He's not. I mean, they might welcome him
back to Boston.
Yeah, they would welcome him back to Boston in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. So yeah, that was I can't believe that one of the greatest players of all time lost the World Series, if you will. I mean, that's hard to say. One play lost it, but ended the World Series on such an awful play. And I noticed, so the World Series wasn't played in 1904, which is kind of interesting because the Giants wouldn't play that particular year. They decided they played in 1903. The Boston Pilgrims won the first World Series against Pittsburgh, and then in 1904, the National League champions, the New York Giants, John McGraw, goes, nah, don't want to play the World Series this year. This really happened.
Why?
I don't think the American League is very good at all. So they didn't play, and the Giants didn't play him, and there was no World Series in 1904. But there was a pitcher that we've talked about, Jack Chesborough, who won 41 games in 1904. So it was a weird season that there wasn't a World Series after they had only the
that's
first
such
one.
an old-timey baseball statistic, though. Like, doesn't it just fit exactly what I remember? There was a tweet flying around last year, or like when we were talking about like Shohei's a ridiculous season, and it'll be like, oh yes, nobody's done this since the 1904 season, where Jack Chesborough threw 41 starts and 670 innings across the season.
No, actually, that guy, a guy named Bill Dineen, completed 37 games that he started during the season, throwing 337 consecutive innings. Talk about old-time baseball.
How did that man's arm not fall off?
So, but I guess you didn't realize that 1904 series, which would have been the second one, never happened because of John McGraw.
And ironically, as much as we talked about how in 1968, Mickey Lulich won Game 7 for the Tigers, October 10th was just actually a really good day for the Tigers in general because they also won Game 7 in 45 on the 10th.
Right. And that was sort of the first real season after the war, right? So the war just ends, World War II.
Yeah. I don't. Is everybody back at that point? Probably not.
Not that season.
Late 45, you still
46 season was really the season that people came back.
Because Williams, people really credit the 3 years he missing as what, like 43 to 45 ish, basically.
Could you imagine, I'm trying to think of a Mike Trout missing 3 years
because he needs to go to Afghanistan.
Right, and the stat loss of what that would be. We have a guy like Williams, hits 521 home runs. Those 3 or 4 years,
he's hit 600.
Yeah, and before people were doing that, other than Babe Ruth, obviously, who carried it before that. So, there's just lots of stuff about this particular day because it was, and what's interesting is today, October 10th, obviously won't be the World Series. You won't have any World Series.
No, so it's going to be interesting that now a lot of the more famous World Series moments that have happened in the modern era, especially since the addition of the extra wild card game, are going to be almost unique because it's only going to be World Series games that happen on these days that happen late in October now. Because, today is the 17th?
Today is the 16th.
16th. Today is the 16th, and we're just after Game 1 of the ALCS, and the Game 1 of the NLCS is taking place today. So if those series go the distance, you're not even looking at playing those games, the World Series starting until like October 20 something.
Right. The World Series is slated to end, I think, like November 3rd or 4th if it goes 7 games.
Right. So you're going to have, which is obviously why people call Derek Jeter Mr. November.
Yeah. That's a little, that's a nod to Reggie Jackson, I guess.
Right. But I think it's more interesting when we're looking at these dates that you're going to actually lose something by having a longer playoff because you're going to be spreading out. You're not going to have these concentrated days where every World Series takes place at the beginning of October. You don't really have that now.
And what's cool is so we can go to October 10th, like we're saying, this date in history, and there's playoff games. It could be a division series game.
There will be playoff games to match with all of these World Series, but you're not going to have the continued tradition of all of these World Series events taking place on the same day is all I'm saying.
Exactly. And that, that's a bit, again, it takes a little of the romance and having all of the night games, by the way, makes it difficult for kids to watch these games, to really experience them firsthand unless they're hearing, watching it the next day on recorded. And who's doing that except for me?
Yeah. And I mean, it's not bad. Like recording the episode it's not a bad alternative. Obviously, it's actually a little bit trickier nowadays because you also have to avoid your phone until you finish watching the game. But there's something to be said for as soon as you start being able to fast forward, as soon as I know I can fast forward through some of the game, it's just well, why not just fast forward to the very last out? You know what I mean? There's that part of you that that I can't help but think that. And so it's just you do lose something when you're watching those games on replay. So I just wish there was some kind of alternative for Major League Baseball so that you don't have incredibly exciting games like Giants Dodgers Game 5 and Red Sox Astros Game 1 ending after midnight. When the majority of the country lives on the East Coast, it isn't staying up to watch that.
Exactly. And I think if you the rest of the country is, I'm jealous,
I'm jealous. I mean, we're jealous the same way we're jealous of the West Coast on football Sundays when you're wait, you got to start watching football at 10 and then you're done at 4 in the afternoon. That's great.
Right. always a better way to do it when you can. And the night game is an afternoon game.
No, exactly. You still have your whole day basically. But so I do think that's something that baseball does need to consider, especially since so much of it people are complaining about the pace of the sport. I mean, yesterday's game, it was a phenomenal game, but it took a long
4
time.
hours.
It went until midnight.
Yeah.
And you're going to have epic moments with players that are going to inspire kids and create fans for life that they're not going to see. That watching a highlight does not hold this.
No, when you're sitting there waiting for it to happen and you're watching it and your heart is pounding because you know the stakes and all that stuff, you can't recreate that if you're fast forwarding.
No, you can't recreate if they're watching that on a Twitter clip.
Right. So I think, that there's something lost there and not to get off topic, but the idea that these games could start earlier in general, we're missing West Coast prime time. I don't even know how valid prime time is anymore, the way that people behave and do things. They don't work at the same times. They don't enjoy things at the same times. And wouldn't it be nice to let kids watch World Series baseball live to a much greater degree than they can now?
Right, because part of the reason why you had the original primetime viewing hours was because that was realistically, if you did not catch things when they were being broadcast, you didn't have the ability to watch them. So, and our ability to mess around with when things are airing was so much harder. So
Right.
now, realistically, you could start the game. What if the game started at 7 instead of 8?
Right. So all it takes, at least you're going to get a chunk of the game.
Yeah.
But the games, actually, the West Coast game will start at 9 sometimes on the East Coast, 9:07
Yeah,
first pitch. I
and
mean,
you literally you can't watch that game if you're on the East Coast, especially if it's a weeknight.
So we talked a lot, by example, we talked a lot about the 1920 baseball season, which is one of my favorite seasons. And that World Series on October 10th, that date was the unassisted triple play, the only one in World Series history by Bill. I can never understand how to say his name, Wamsgans or whatever it would be. And that was an amazing series. But here's the thing. It took place in the afternoon. Everybody that was there saw it, and everybody heard about it the same day. So there's that excitement. There's so much focus on the World Series that I don't even know if that series was probably not covered on radio, because that's before they were covering that. And so the only ticker tapes and ticker and people sort of going through news wires to be able to communicate,
Get that info. Yeah.
That's an incredible series that the Indians won in 1920. But all the kids and the adults got the information at the same time.
Right, and that is the unfortunate part. You look at it now where you're like, oh, well, I can't look at my phone, can't go on live TV, because if you turned on ESPN the next morning, you're going to instantly know who won that game.
Exactly. It all happens at the at the same time. So what else you got?
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting that the one thing I do notice is there's not as much when you get in terms of what I was researching that had more recent stuff. So I don't know if you have anything that's more recent, but I did think that was something that was particularly interesting was, I guess for me, it's no longer recent, but, well, I mean, obviously this isn't necessarily game related, but I remember what happened in October 10th in the middle of the 2000s. With the whole steroid thing, because that was when this was one of the days where they were doing the trials. I'm pretty sure this was the day Palmeiro got out of his jury charges or whatever he had. He had some kind of perjury charges, and they decided not to let him go after talking about testing positive for a steroid. So I mean, this is a day that's even connected to that entire era in a sense.
So I'll go old school on you and go back to the first year of Yankee Stadium. And it's 1923. So the house that Ruth built, and really was built on him. The first World Series game ever played in Yankee Stadium was played on October 10th, 1920. So the Yankees built the stadium. Mm-hmm. They've never won a World Series before this. They were in the World Series in 21, but they lost to the Giants. Okay, so this is not the Yankees of
the vaunted Yankees.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a team trying to win its first World Championship. So they open their new stadium, they play a World Series, and they win the World Series in the first year at their new stadium.
That'll do something for you.
Right? Didn't happen at Citi Field for the Mets, by the way.
Didn't happen at Shea.
Yeah, it didn't happen at Shea.
I mean, they did set a record that year, but it wasn't. No, wait.
That was 64. They were just horribly bad, not all-time bad like they were in 1962.
Okay. Much better, at least.
Very, very big difference there. So I thought that that started the 28 World Championships for the Yankees. So I think that's pretty interesting that happened in their first go round. And then in 1948. The largest crowd ever to attend a World Series game in Cleveland's Municipal Stadium. And and you probably don't remember this stadium. It was a football. It was a multi-purpose stadium.
Yeah, because Jake got built before I was
Jake
really
got built, and I don't know
cognizant.
The Browns weren't playing in Municipal Stadium. I don't think. Anyway, it was huge.
The Browns were gone by the time I was aware.
It was eight. No, well, that's right. They'd gone to Baltimore, and then they came back as the new Browns. The stadium seated 80,000 people, so it was by far the biggest stadium in baseball. And because it was a football stadium, I can't imagine like some of the baseball fans there for the 1948 World Series against the Boston Braves had to be so far away from the action. I didn't even know they could even see what the heck was going on.
Yeah, you can't even tell what's happening. It's like awful seats.
Well, so and I never got to go see in that. So on this day, Warren Spahn beats Bob Feller and the Indians in Game 5 of the Fall Classic. So that wasn't 86,000 people showed up at a baseball game. Can you imagine 86,000
That's a lot of
for
people.
A baseball game? I mean, the only stadium that was bigger and hosted more people for a game was when the Dodgers moved to L.A. before they built Dodger Stadium. They played in the Coliseum where USC plays. That place seats 92,000.
I doubt they sold that out too often.
They didn't sell it, but I think they had more people at a game.
I believe they. Yes, I just doubt they were selling that out too often.
59 World Series. And I think about the Dodgers, right? At the same time, they moved to L.A. in 58, and they win the World Series in L.A. in 59. How weird is that?
I mean, it's great for building a fan base.
Yeah, well, exactly. And then they played in the World Series and several times between then and the mid-60s. In 63, they won. In 65, they won. So they're in L.A. for 7 years. They've won 3 World Series.
You're gonna have a lot of dedicated little fans. That's why there's a ton of hardcore Dodger fans.
And that was the wait till next year Dodgers. Before that, they only won the one World Series.
Nobody in L.A. thought that.
Right?
About
Exactly.
them.
We love this team. They win all the time. So I think it's just really fun to just think about the different things that happen on a particular day. And what's weird is it won't be like the Babe Ruth first year in Yankee Stadium. That was Game 1 of the World Series. Sometimes it's Game 1. Sometimes it's Game 7.
Yeah.
There's no predictability.
Now there's not even going to be World Series.
Exactly. There won't be any World Series.
Early postseason games and wild card games.
Exactly. So I don't think that you can expect that there's going to be as many epic performances because is the performance in the wild card game or the division series equal to doing something formidable in the World Series?
Well, I think you have to look at it separately. You're not going to have these it's going to be harder to have these all-time days as much as we were saying earlier because the World Series always kind of took place around the same couple of days every year, the same stretch of 14 or so days. But you're still going to have the history where you're going to be able to look back for any day that's in the standard baseball calendar, and you're going to have 100+ years of history for stuff that's happened on that day, and there might be really incredible things. I bet there's some day in the random calendar year where like a bajillion no-hitters have been thrown.
Right. Well, more than any other day.
More than any other day. There's like 7 no-hitters, or there's like a bunch of perfect games on a particular day. We know that's got to have happened.
So, when they talk about this date in history, during the World Series stuff, there's another one here, and this is really weird, and I didn't know this. In 1963, the Mets, and you think I would know, had traded coaches with the Giants. Okay, bringing Wes Westrom to the New York in exchange for Cookie Lavagetto, who was recovering from a serious. So they traded coaches because Stengel met and became fond of his new coach, and so he anointed Wes Westrom as the next manager of the Mets, which he did become before they got rid of him and got Gil Hodges, and that's when the Mets obviously ended up being good and going forward. But that they traded why would you trade a coach? What kind of value would a coach have that you'd have to trade an asset to get him?
I guess at the end, we've seen that before because didn't that happen? That's happened in football
with a baseball with like a non-manager,
with a non-manager. Not that I know of. No,
like we want your third base coach and we'll give you our draft pick. Who would do that?
Nobody.
Exactly. So I don't know. It doesn't say what they gave up for him there, but that was just stuff going on.
A Twix bar. I don't know.
And whatnot. So I think we could probably pick every day in October and come up with some interesting stuff.
That's the thing. You could pick any day. Any day in the baseball calendar year, and you could find a ton of stuff like this. And that's what makes baseball so cool. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Cool.